It's kind of funny how this movie reminds you of the hectic, unplanned travel that you had to do back in high school or in ground school or public school or whatever, where we always going to these cheap places and there was complete chaos and no one knew what's going to happen next and anything. Good times. Hello, my name is Daidarius and welcome to the review for Spider-Man Far From Home. So Spider-Man Far From Home is the bajillionth movie in the MCU and is the closing movie for the Infinity Saga. That's right, this is the final movie in the Phase 3, which means that I need to make that movie I promised after Endgame, so look forward to that. Nonetheless, the world grieves the loss of Tony Stark, and we really see that empty hole that he has left. However, Peter tries his best to just be the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and he has to go on this trip to Europe with his high school for some sciencey stuff, where he has this plan to try and not propose, but just to tell MJ how he feels, because apparently now he actually has feeling for MJ. So yeah, in the meantime, there is these elementals that comes to Earth. It's a stone and wind and water and fire guy, and they came through a rift that the snap that Thanos did has left open. And trying to fight these elementals is our hero Mysterio, who's trying to help Nick Fury fighting these bad guys, and they need the help of Spider-Man because every other hero is apparently, not able to be there. They are out of reach, so to speak. And that is pretty much the plot of this movie summed up. So, what did I like about this movie? First of all, just as I liked about Ant-Man after Age of Ultron, I like this movie because it is a step down in threat level from the former movie, which was Endgame, which was this huge universe-ending battle that needed to be won, whereas here it's just a guy who's going to a vacation trip and then apparently he needs to fight some elemental dudes, but that is pretty much it. I also like the way this movie just depicts how it is to be a high schooler or just being a teenager in general, in case you didn't go to high school. All this awkwardness and what you think is important for your image and so on, it really puts you back in that situation, or if you're a high schooler now, it just emphasizes that situation that you're going through right now. The acting is also well done, and even though that most of these characters is now above 20 years old, they still manage to act like high schoolers, and you kind of still buy that they are roughly 16 years old, but I mean, they can't make much more of these movies without doing a time jump, because let's be honest, they're not really looking like teenagers anymore. But nonetheless, the acting is fine. I really enjoyed the acting. It wasn't the best acting I've ever seen in the MCU, but it wasn't the worst either. It was this safe acting where you just kind of forget it and just enjoys the movie as a whole. I really also like the villain in this movie, and if you have read the comics or have seen the Spider-Man TV series or just know anything about Spider-Man, then you know who the villain is. However, if you haven't, I won't spoil it here, but just know that the way they use the villain is the most interesting usage of a villain we have seen in the MCU for a long time. I mean, I didn't thought that Thanos' villainy was groundbreaking. We have seen it a lot of times. There was a villain who wanted to destroy the whole or just part of the entire universe. Whatever their motivation might be, they still want to do this, and they want to destroy it with a MacGuffin. Whereas here, it is not quite like that. I mean, we have seen this in another movie before, and not in the MCU, but just in another movie before. So when you see it, you completely know. But the way this villain fight and this villain's ability is just unlike what we have seen before, even though we had a chance to see it before in Infinity War and Endgame, because, the Infinity Gauntlet can basically do whatever you want it to do, but we didn't really see that aspect of it. Unfortunately, we actually managed to see it here, and I appreciate it because it made for some very fun, entertaining action sequences, which might be the next thing that I liked about this movie, which was the action. The action was, well, fun, entertaining. It was new thinking. It was trying to put Spider-Man in a situation that he really hadn't been before. I mean, how does Spider-Man fight something made out of fire or water or some just basically the elements. How does he do that? How does he need to think to come out of the situation and also manage to save people and all those shebangs? That was fun and entertaining to watch. And then there's a lot of scenes in this movie that you haven't really seen Spider-Man doing before, which again is a great plus. I just love the fact that this movie feels wholehearted. There was really a lot of heart and effort and love for the soft material put into this, even though that they kind of took it in a different direction that we're used to. But then again, this is the MCU Spider-Man. This is not the Spider-Man that we knew from the olden times. I won't say olden times. I mean, in the 90s and even the comic book now. This Spider-Man is more high-tech, and even though that might turn some people off, the high-tech part of Spider-Man is actually toned down a bit in this movie, which again, I appreciate. Oh, and also this movie has the best cameo in movie history ever. I mean, well, if we usually don't cheer or clap or do anything throughout a movie because, you know, we are civilized people. But this is probably the first and possibly only time that I have actually experienced that people, you know, were cheering for something happening on the screen, and here just happened to be, you know, this epic cameo. So look forward to that. That is it is legendary, and that is selling it short. There's also other things I like about this movie, such as the pacing, the characterizations. The story was simple enough, yet it has enough depth to it that it's actually worth watching. The setup for Peter's character arc, the setup for a future character arc, which is not necessarily connected to Peter, and just Peter's whole balancing act of being a teenage high schooler and also a superhero. I like those aspects. However, I can't stand here, you know, reviewing this movie forever, so let's just jump into what I didn't appreciate about this movie. Now, first of all, is the Tony Stark aspect of this movie. There is a big hole after Tony Stark died, as I said before, and Peter kind of feel like it is his responsibility to fill in that hole, but he's not ready for it. He don't know how to be Tony Stark. He doesn't know how to be Iron Man. I mean, Tony barely knew how to be Iron Man. He always second-guessed his own choices. So how do you fill that hole? Unfortunately, they only address it in the beginning of the movie and then near the end of the movie. It isn't really used throughout the movie. It doesn't really show that it nags at him. It doesn't really show that he's insecure about himself in that regard. It is just something that he needs to overcome at the end of the movie, and it's set up in the beginning of the movie, and then it really isn't addressed throughout the movie, which kind of bumps me out because his death was a big deal in Endgame. This is actually a perfect chance to have an impact on those heroes that need to take up the mantle after the original Avengers, but we don't get it here, unfortunately. Which really sucks, because when we actually get to that part where he has to take up the mantle, it really doesn't feel earned. And I don't mean that I don't want Peter Parker to be the new Tony Stark, but I do mind that they presented this as a character development for Peter Parker, even though it hasn't really shown to be a hurdle to overcome. I also really didn't think that the story was as interesting as it was in the former movie, specifically because we're just jumping from location to location throughout this vacation, and I don't mind the location jumping. What I do mind is that these location jumping has no impact besides that Peter needs to fight these elementals, and that's basically it. So what we end up getting in the downtimes is Peter trying to get a chance to tell MJ how he feels, and that gets stale pretty fast. Not that I mind that there is this love story for these teenagers, but what I do mind is that that is the sole focus of the downtimes. There is nothing else. Whereas in the former Spider-Man movie, yes, there was the love story where he's trying to get this... what's he called, Liz or something? I can't remember her name, but he was trying to get her to the homecoming dance. Whereas the Spider-Man was trying to proving himself to Tony that he was actually able to be a good superhero. So there was those two balancing acts, besides the fact there was this whole plot thing with the Vulture. Whereas here, you have the elementals that he's trying to defeat, and then you have this love story part that's just taking too much over everything else. So I just wish there was more to the plot than just those two aspects. And I don't mean that we need more for the villain plot, for the superhero stuff, but I wanted more for the human aspect of the story, and that kind of bumps me out. Which kind of brings me to the pacing. Now, the pacing was well done. It didn't feel as a bumpy ride as it could have been. However, throughout the movie, it kind of pulls the handbrake a lot, because now it needs to set up the next part of this story, which at a certain point is kind of bumpy, because it needs to do something with the story that I can't spoil, but it needs to do something with the story that brings this movie to a halt, and then it needs to set up the second part of the movie, which is kind of a bummer. And then we're left with this ongoing love story that doesn't really go anywhere, and every time that we focus on that, you kind of want to get back to the Spider-Man stuff, and when we focus on the Spider-Man stuff, you're kind of waiting for us to get back to the human aspect of the story, even though the human aspect of the story isn't really present. And then there is the final fight with the final villain. There's a cool scene up until the fight with the villain that I like, but I kind of wish there was more to this villain, to the fight with this villain, and especially to the conclusion of that villain, because after that thing has concluded, they kind of just brush this thing off and that is it, even though it should have an incredible, huge impact on Peter Parker. But it doesn't, which is kind of annoying considering that he is a teenager. This is a huge chance to make Peter grow, but no, we're not gonna do that. But besides that, I actually appreciated a lot of things for this movie. The acting, the pacing, the visual effects, the action sequences, the story, and even the villain. The villain was exceptional. He's not the best villain in the MCU, but he's getting up there. However, the lack of impact of Tony's death and also the human love story thingy was kind of a minus for me. But I will say that Spider-Man Far From Home, it is worth watching and worth buying on Blu-ray. So yes, I really loved this movie. It is not as good as the former movie, but I still think that it should have the same grades. If that makes or not grade rating. I don't grade my movies, I rate my movies. That's a difference. But yeah, I still think they are on the same par. But if I had to put a number on it, this movie will be roughly 4.8, and then the former movie would roughly be 5.1. So it's a little margin, but it's what sells the other movie for me. However, Spider-Man Far From Home, have you seen it? What do you think about it? And do you think it was fitting that this movie was gonna cap off the Infinity Saga? Or do you think, as I do, that this movie should have started the Phase 4? Because it doesn't really feel like this is the end of the Infinity Saga. It just feels like this is the new beginning. Whatever you think, comment below me your thoughts. And as always, until I see you in the next video, remember to stay awesome. Bye! Spider-Man! Spider-Man!